George Mason was one of the most influential Americans you've probably never heard of. Unlike many of his fellow Virginians, Washington, Jefferson, Madison, Mason never became president, never signed the Constitution, and never sought national fame. But he may have done more than any of them to shape the liberties we now take for granted. Born in 1725 to a wealthy planter family in Fairfax County, Virginia, Mason inherited land, education, and a powerful name. Yet he was no mere aristocrat. Orphaned at age 10, he was raised by an uncle who helped shape his rigorous education in the law, classical literature, and political philosophy. He studied Locke, Montesquieu, and the British common law, and those influences would one day help him redefine the concept of liberty in America. Mason's political rise began not with speeches, but with quiet determination. He shunned the spotlight, preferring his vast personal library at Gunston Hall to the chaos of political life. Yet when the colonies began resisting British authority in the 1760s, Mason's pen proved more powerful than many swords. In 1774, he co-authored the Fairfax Resolves with George Washington, a bold declaration of colonial rights and grievances that foreshadowed the Declaration of Independence. It was Mason's first major public stand, and it revealed his deep suspicion of unchecked government power, whether British or American. 2 years later, in the spring of 1776, Mason would take center stage at the Virginia Convention. While Thomas Jefferson was drafting the Declaration of Independence in Philadelphia, Mason was writing something just as revolutionary in Williamsburg, the Virginia Declaration of Rights. This document didn't merely declare separation from Britain. It outlined, in clear philosophical terms, the inherent and inalienable rights of man, that all men are by nature equally free, that government is instituted for the common benefit, that the people have a right to reform or abolish it when it becomes destructive. It introduced the idea of freedom of the press, trial by jury, and the free exercise of religion. It was the first document in the American colonies to spell out a comprehensive list of individual rights, and it served as a blueprint not just for the U.S. Bill of Rights, but for future democratic revolutions around the world. Jefferson borrowed heavily from it. Madison respected it deeply, but it was Mason who wrote it. Mason also played a major role in drafting Virginia's first constitution and became a mentor and philosophical guide for many younger revolutionaries. Yet, as the American Revolution gave way to the challenges of forming a new national government, Mason's ideals would bring him into conflict with the very men he had inspired. In 1787, Mason was chosen as one of Virginia's delegates to the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia. At first, he participated actively in the debates, offering proposals and working to improve the emerging framework. But as the summer wore on, he became increasingly alarmed. Mason saw three major problems with the proposed Constitution. First, the lack of a Bill of Rights. He warned that without explicit protections for individual liberties, the new federal government could easily trample on the rights of the people. Second, the power of the presidency. Mason feared that the vague language about executive authority could lead to something dangerously close to monarchy. He called for limits, term restrictions, and checks that others deemed unnecessary. Third, the continued acceptance of slavery. Though a slaveholder himself, Mason opposed the international slave trade and saw its protection in the Constitution as a moral and political failure. As the convention concluded and delegates lined up to sign the final draft, Mason refused. He was one of only 3 who withheld their signatures. When asked why, he replied bluntly, "I would sooner chop off my right hand than put to the Constitution as it now stands." This decision cost him dearly. Friends like George Washington distanced themselves. Political allies turned cold. Mason's refusal to compromise made him a pariah in some circles, but it also made him a hero to others. He returned to Virginia and became one of the leading voices of the anti-federalist movement. In pamphlets, speeches, and letters, he laid out his objections to the Constitution, warning that the federal government would grow too powerful and too disconnected from the people it claimed to serve. His writings resonated. Across the country, citizens began demanding changes. The Constitution's ratification stalled in several states. Patrick Henry and others invoked Mason's words as they argued for greater protections. Eventually, James Madison, who had initially resisted the idea, agreed to propose a series of amendments once the Constitution was adopted. Those 10 amendments became the Bill of Rights. And in almost every line, you can hear the voice of George Mason. Freedom of speech, freedom of religion, the right to bear arms, protection from unreasonable searches, due process, the right to a fair trial, protection from cruel and unusual punishment. These weren't federal innovations. They were Mason's legacy. Despite this enormous contribution, Mason faded from public life after 1787. He never ran for national office, never published memoirs, and never sought to rehabilitate his image. He died in 1792, largely unknown to a nation that owed him much. Today, there's no holiday for George Mason, no place on Mount Rushmore. But his influence lives on in the rights we cherish and the protections we often take for granted. His home, Gunston Hall, still stands, a quiet monument to a loud conscience. Mason believed that power, left unchecked, always expands. That liberty, once surrendered, is rarely regained. And that the job of the citizen is not to worship leaders, but to hold them accountable. He warned that even well-intentioned governments can drift toward tyranny if the people become complacent. He refused to sign a flawed document not because he was disloyal, but because he was loyal to something higher, the idea that government must serve the people, not the other way around. George Mason didn't sign the Constitution, but his refusal made it stronger. And in a time when dissent is too often dismissed as disloyalty, his example reminds us that principled resistance is sometimes the most patriotic act of all.